Joining us on the podcast is multi-instrumentalist, composer, and bandleader Peter Apfelbaum. Born in Berkeley, California, he started playing drums at just the age of 3 years old, and then later took up piano and saxophone, forming his first band by age 11. A product of the renowned Berkeley High Jazz program, he founded the 17-piece Hieroglyphics Ensemble in 1977 as a vehicle for his own compositions, which blended world music and avant-garde jazz. Over the years, he's performed and recorded with jazz legends such as Don Cherry and Carla Bley, also touring extensively across the world. His work with the Hieroglyphics Ensemble and his collaborations with Don Cherry's group have solidified his reputation as an innovative and boundary-pushing musician. And we're excited to have him on the podcast today. So welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Abe. Great to be here, man.
Oh, my pleasure. Peter, we were just talking a little bit before we recorded, and you're probably one of the unique musicians in this world. Let's call it just improvisational music. There's so much versatile artistry. We're talking about playing duets with Mark Juliana. We're talking about working with Daphnis Prieto, playing saxophone. Yeah, have you always been that way, like throughout, did you feel like this was the way your career was going to go, like when you look back, like being involved in all these different things?
Yeah, it is yes and no, because it is kind of the way that my life has always been for one reason or another, going back to as a toddler before I was even 3 years old. I was just one of these kids that was attracted to sound. And all kids have the creative impulse naturally. And I was just lucky. I guess it was a combination of whatever it was that made me drawn to that. And then a variety of really, fortunate or fortuitous circumstances. I mean, I was in a daycare center, or they used to call it nursery school, where the teacher had stuff for the kids to play with. There was no prescribed thing that kids had to do at that age. In that way, she was great because she just let kids do their thing, whether they wanted to play in the sandbox or play with clay or finger painting. And I did some of all of that, but I mostly gravitated to this one corner where she had an old spinning piano and like a gong and a pair of bongo drums and like a little xylophone. And I just started spending every day there. Um, and I was just interested in sound, and
You
even
remember
made some.
this. You remember this.
Well, I have some help. I do remember parts of it, but actually, as luck would have it, the woman who was the head of that school, Eleanor Griffin, was kind of a visionary um, person in the world of young people's, I guess you could call it education, although she wasn't about teaching. She was more about facilitating, I guess. She went on to write a book about her experiences as a nursery school teacher. It's called Island of Childhood. And there's actually a chapter on me, on what I was doing between ages 3 and 5 there. So I had some help remembering, like she writes some things in it. You can find the book online. It's actually kind of a fascinating book just for anybody who deals with kids. I'm not a parent, but I have goddaughters and just in terms of understanding children. She was somebody who didn't have children of her own, but she had a child psychology PhD actually. Anyway, so that was how my early life with music began. I was basically a drummer at first. I had some drum lessons at age 5. Um, but I was more into, I guess you could say, composing or just putting sounds together, making up little pieces with lyrics. And by the time I was 7, I got to start playing drums in the Berkeley School jazz program, which was started by Dr. Herb Wong. He was a visionary who knew and brought in Duke Ellington, Ross Unroland Kirk, Oscar Peterson to the school. And I actually wasn't at the particular school to see those people, but that's the kind of thing that he brought into the community in Berkeley, California.
Way
Um,
ahead of his time, sounds like.
Way ahead of his time on all kinds of things, jazz in education. He was kind of one of the first people who started what became the IAJE and Gen Conference. It all kind of is an outgrowth of largely of him. Um, so I had the opportunity to play with older kids playing drums. By the time I was in elementary school, you could check out instruments the way you can check out books from a library. So I checked out a saxophone and had a fingering chart. I'm pretty much self-taught, or at least that's a large part of my training is just figuring it out. I had piano lessons with a great pianist, a couple of great pianists in the Bay Area, Dick Whittington, who's still around, and Bill Bell, who's no longer with us. But they would kind of show me along the way, jazz voicings and things like that. So basically, by the time I was 11, 12 years old, I was playing drums, saxophone, and piano, and those just became the three main instruments that I've always played. I kind of feel like I need them all to, it's like you write and you can't write with just the vowels or just the consonants. And you know how it is being a guitar player. You probably sometimes need to use the pick, and other times you know, whatever, wah-wah pedal or whatever. You want to have a wide palette. And
Which
so for
I think, that's the biggest blessing you can have as an artist, to have that openness to a wide palette, because so many artists, especially in our music we get, they're very they get closed off and locked into their what they do, and that's it.
Yeah, they do. And I can understand that to a point. People get specialized. People play, they want to just get into the style of Joe Henderson or maybe the style of Count Basie, or in classical music, you have early music specialists. I can kind of understand that. But for me, it was you know, one reason I consider myself so lucky is that I had the freedom to experiment and kind of develop this sound palette of the different instruments that I ended up playing. Um, but also growing up in the Bay Area was kind of magical because it there was so much music around. And so in the Bay Area we had, jazz groups playing everywhere. The jazz avant-garde was in full swing. Um, One thing that I've reflected on a lot and written about too, is that just going to a jazz club in the early 70s when I was 12, 13 years old, just looking at what a drummer had was already different from what a drummer had 10 years before. Like a drummer would often have conga drums, gongs, even hubcaps, bells, there might be tablas. Saxophone players were sometimes playing like a Middle Eastern oboe, like a Shania.
Have you ever
Uh,
seen the stand-up special by Fred Armisen, Stand Up for Drummers?
I can imagine it's great because he's brilliant, but no, I haven't.
You should watch this. You should.
I'm
It's
writing it down. Okay.
because he goes through all the different drums from, way when they call them trap drummers.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
yeah, or
Wow. I'll have to check that out. So yeah, so it was like everything was expanding, and the other thing that I think was so important about jazz at that time, um, new music in general, and also, the jazz avant-garde, which I think of as, the main pioneers were African American musicians, from the Bay Area, from Chicago, from New York, from Louisiana. And the amazing thing about that, going to see the Art Ensemble of Chicago or Pharoah Sanders, even John Handy, who I got to know, he's in the Bay Area, still with us at 90, whatever, is that the music became very international. Like the instrumentation became very international, but that thing that what we call jazz has always had, from Jelly Roll Morton with the Spanish tinge, to Chano Pozo with Dizzy Gillespie, to Charles Lloyd with music from Asia, India. It just grew and expanded, and that was kind of emblematic of the Bay Area, because in addition to jazz, I was interested in contemporary classical music. On weekends, I would go up to UC Berkeley and play rumba, with the guys that were playing rumba and even some bata, and that became part of what I do. It became ingrained in me, so that years later, when I would meet Daphnis Prieto from Cuba, some of that vocabulary he was delving into felt very familiar, and so the rhythms didn't really throw me off, and I felt like I could, we have a vocabulary in common there. So I'm sort of moving around, but basically it's all just to kind of answer the question about, has my life always been like this and did I anticipate? The no part is I didn't know, I had no idea what was going to happen, but I did know I was going to be a musician. There was about 6 months when I was 10 years old where I wanted to be a bus driver. I would watch bus drivers and I was fascinated by the wheel and everything, like kids can be. But that passed. Um, and it passed partly because of an incident where I broke into a bus yard and I drove a bus around the yard and I didn't get caught, but my piano teacher, who I bragged about it to, called me up and he like pretended to be somebody from the bus company. And I was so scared that I never went back and tried that again. That kind of like ended my fascination with being a bus driver. But yeah, so all of that is to say, I had a bunch of lucky circumstances. I was always interested in music. So by the time I started hieroglyphics, when I was 17, still in Berkeley High School, um, I was starting to have a lot of ideas about music, and just have been lucky to continue that.
Do you feel, I mean, that you have the outlets to do what you want to do creatively? I mean, obviously, like the skills to do so, but do you feel satisfied in terms of, the venues you perform in and or the frequency at this point, or is it still like you're longing for? Because I feel like even with artists like yourself, some of them might still they are grasp they want more frequency, that sort of thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. More frequency. Yeah. And I do feel that. There are musicians my age, I'm 64. There are some who have had that and they want to slow down, or they have a family, they have other reasons for not wanting to go on the road or devoting more time to teaching, which is something I'm grateful to also do. Um, but yeah, I would say mostly I do feel that I have what I need. We keep going with the hieroglyphics. It's now New York hieroglyphics. Um, and there's a handful of the original players that started with me in the 70s in Berkeley that now live in New York. There's now a crop of younger musicians who have been playing with us. And that's something that I'm really glad to be able to continue kind of when I want to do it. There's sometimes where the year goes by and we don't play. But we just kind of recently reconvened and played Winter Jazz
Well,
Festival
the
here.
reason I ask is because I was speaking with Eric Wyatt, the New York tenor saxophonist, on my podcast, and
Yeah,
you guys are the same age, and he was talking to me about it's about the challenges still where he is in his career, about we're talking about, I guess you could say, the frequency or the venues, that sort of thing. So I was just kind of wondering if where your outlook is on this. But you're a West Coaster too. So yeah, I just want to, just was just curious about that. I mean, how you felt in that way.
thank you. That's a very relevant question, and it's something that I talk about uh, frequently with my friends, peers that are going through maybe also have
Colleagues.
a band. Um, I mean, as I say, I'm lucky to have the hieroglyphics, and I feel like in some ways I'm still growing, expanding the instrumentation. Everybody's a multi-instrumentalist. So we're, doing things we've never done before with different combinations of instruments. Um, but then again, for that reason, I would like to be doing more, excuse me, with that group. Actually, I mean, there's actually probably 4 or 5 projects that are ongoing that I enjoy doing. There's that, I do solo piano. I do duo with an old friend of mine, percussionist Josh Jones in the Bay Area. We have a multi-culti trio, which is a tribute to Don Cherry, that it's me and Josh and the bass player from that group, Bo Freeman, where we do Don Cherry's music and my music and Monk and Ornette and music that we did with Don. Um, those are all things that I would like to be doing more. And it's an ongoing challenge. I know anybody who has led a band and has a vision for especially the sound that they want or their own music, that can be the most gratifying thing. And it can always be a struggle. I try to not have it be a struggle because I think there's an art that all of us kind of learn as we go through life to try to work with what's there and then but try to change what we
That's
can,
beautifully said.
right? And so, I consider myself adaptive and, I've found ways to be resourceful and teaching is something that I've done, the last 25, 30 years that I truly love. I love to be able to share music.
I'm an educator as well. I can see where you're coming from.
Yeah, I know. I bet you can. And I'm grateful for that. And I'm also grateful for, you know, um, when I'm not doing something actively with hieroglyphics or don't have a gig with this duo with Josh Jones or something, there's a handful of people that I work with pretty regularly that if I'm not doing something, they've got something going on. One of them you mentioned is Daphnis Prieto, the wonderful drummer and composer, originally from Cuba, that I played with now since I guess going about 28 years, going back to like 97.
He's
Uh,
special. He's a special drummer.
he's very special. He's very special. Yeah, I could talk a lot about Daphnis. He's a great friend, and we have certain things in common because we both have for a long time had our own groups where we write everything. We both we do the same thing. We write the bass parts. We write, not that everything has to be restrictive in that way, but we it's not just okay, this is a swing tune, or this is a Latin tune or whatever. No, it's we've got specific things. So we sometimes laugh about that because we can both be a little more specific than some other band leaders in the jazz world. But Daphnis and I, I just had the pleasure on playing with, I think either the seventh or eighth album of his came out last year, and we just did gigs. It's a quartet, and we did gigs in New York. We played it, I guess your alma mater. We played at Berkeley in Boston
Ah,
at the Performance Center there.
beautiful
Uh,
venue.
Yeah, beautiful venue. I love playing there. And we were in Mexico and DC. And so that's one thing that has been happening. We're playing in Miami April 11th, for anybody who's in that area. But you can check out daphnisprieto.com. It tells you about all that. Steven Bernstein is another old friend who's from the Bay Area, who's a year younger than me, trumpet player and band leader. Mostly a arranger, but he's in recent years started composing more of his own music.
Is it okay if I ask you about working with Mark Juliana?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, he's one of these, musicians that just like, yeah, a mystery among the jazzers in a sense. You know what I mean? Little-
I think so. Mark, yeah, Mark is an amazing musician. We met playing years ago with a group called the Jazz Mandolin Project. And it was a trio, usually let's see, mandolin, bass, drums, and me. So I guess it was quartet. Um, Sometimes they played without me. John Fishman, the drummer in the group Fish, had been the drummer in that. Um, and
I
yeah,
definitely know about the group. My friend, he hit me to all that music when I was much younger, actually.
oh yeah,
Mhm.
right on. So yeah, this guy Jamie Macefield led the group and put it together, and he had some great musicians pass through. And Mark and I both played in it at a certain point of time in time. I was playing a lot of keyboards. I have a Chord CX3 organ that's kind of been my jam for a long time. Um, and then we'd run into each other. I guess we did a couple gigs with different people, and then it was the video that you mentioned earlier to me that you had seen on YouTube is
Oh,
from
I was in the zone just listening to it.
yeah, yeah, I know what you mean. So that was from a week at the Old Stone in New York City, where musicians are asked to curate a week and program a week of performances. And I had the idea to call Mark to play as a duo. And we actually also invited, or I invited, somebody I had admired but never worked with and never even met, who was Sar Naguja. He was, for anybody who saw the Fela musical on Broadway, he was the star, like the alternate Fela. He played Fela. There was another guy whose name I forget who was usually it, but Sar, is a wonderful musician from West Africa, although he's more known as an actor and a spoken word person. So we did a night of, excuse me, completely improvised um, music with Mark doing his thing and me playing piano and organ and some percussion, saxophone and flute. And then in part of it, Sar improvised with us or did even poems that he wrote. I even gave him a Dylan Thomas poem because I'm a big Dylan Thomas fan. And he did what actors do. He took it, he left the venue. He said, I'm going for a walk. So he went for a walk. He came back about 15 minutes later and he had it memorized. And he said, I just need to spend time with it and go out and do that. And it was beautiful. So I think that was the last time I worked with Mark. It's been some years
Well,
now.
it's very special for anyone who's listening to be asked to curate something. We're talking about John Zorn, and
And Zorn, right. Yeah.
it's an honor, I guess, a real big honor to be asked to curate there.
Yeah, absolutely. I was really grateful for that. I think I've done that, I guess, a total of 3 times now over the years. And that was the only one I did with Mark. But the last thing I'll say about Mark, that's one of the things I love about him, and it relates to many of the other musicians that I enjoy working with, is that Mark can improvise in a situation like that. And he comes from the world of jazz, but he also has like the hip hop thing, he's got the electronics thing. And I love that because honestly, back in the 70s when free jazz was happening, I love that. I'm all about it. But I don't want it to sound like that today. I can't. I have too many other influences, but I can still use that aesthetic. The music can get very dense, it can get very abstract, but it can be very restrained. It can even be, Mark is great because he can be extremely refined and he can be very crude. And I love that. Daphnis does that too. Not every drummer who's got all that information or musicians who get all that information can play like just completely like they don't know
You know
anything.
what I loved about the way you were playing on that was, like usually when you might hear somebody play in that situation, like let's just say call it the piano, just that even though it's other things, can just move from one idea to the next, and it just, they don't let it be your idea is just the way they developed, like they're like little seeds that grew into plants, and then it was, you know what I mean? Then it was like they went for just such a special amount of time. It was just what I wanted to hear as a listener. And
Wow, great to hear.
what I think someone who may not, if the first being exposed to it, they would love that, that aesthetic.
That's great to hear. I mean, I have noticed that that particular video has gotten a lot of views, and I think that's partly because people naturally go to Mark Juliana. He's kind of a drum god in this time who's in a lot of different worlds. He's played with Saint Vincent, people like that, that a lot of the jazz people are not really even aware of that much. So he's got a huge fan base. Um, but that's good to hear about the music. I mean, we try for that organic thing, and also for me, what often is the key to making a purely improvised performance work is to not get too stuck. You know what I mean? You don't want to push it, but you want to let it keep moving. And I often think back to something Herbie Hancock said in an interview about working with Miles. He said, we'd be playing, and then he said, I would have an idea of something to add to the conversation. And just as I was about to play it, the conversation would take a turn. And he's like, what I was just going to play wasn't going to work anymore. It was obsolete. And the ability to have that awareness, I think, is beautiful. I mean, you could go even further and say that that's kind of a great thing to try for in life in general, right? Because life is always changing, every day is different. And I feel like, you and I and the people that are in this music are so lucky to have a career or, a calling in life that embraces change, you know. And so that's
Change is
one thing.
change is change is the best.
It can be the best of all, yeah. Right. I didn't even have a chance to get tired of that thing I was just doing because it's moving. So you keep being surprised. And that's one thing I love about playing with Mark or Daphnis or Steven Bernstein or, any of these people. They
Well,
share that.
that skill set that you're talking about, to deal with, we have an awareness as improvisers about impermanence in a sense and adapting. It's that skill set that we naturally bring into the day to day.
Yeah, yeah. That's true. We do, don't we? We I hope I do. That is something. But I think, yeah, I think you do. That's true. I think you do get used to change. You accept change in a certain way that can make you more welcoming of it in other aspects of life. Yeah.
I also wanted to talk to you about, you had mentioned something that you were working on. I know you want before we started talking about this with the word creative in it. Do you remember we were
Yeah,
talking?
yeah. Yeah. I would like to talk about that. So, uh, in the early 70s, actually 1971, a couple from Germany who some people might be familiar with, Karl Berger, who's a pianist and vibraphone player, an educator, and also philosopher, who was from Heidelberg, and his wife Ingrid, who took the name Scherzo, a Buddhist name later on, Ingrid Scherzo, who's a singer and poet. Um, they had come from Germany, where they both had backgrounds playing jazz of the time, 50s and 60s, but had gotten really interested in the music of Ornette Coleman and Don Cherry and those people. And they went to Paris. One thing led to another. They met Don Cherry. Karl immediately got hired into Don Cherry's group. And after spending a year in Paris, they had some gigs in the States and they came over to the States and it was Ornette Coleman who said to Karl and Ingrid, you guys should really think about moving here. And they talked about starting some kind of educational program that would make it possible for people to study with, or not just study, but be with, I guess you could say, learn from in different ways, musicians who were not at that time um, musicians that you could study with anywhere else. They weren't part of academia. Um, so Karl and Ingrid and Ornette started what became called Creative Music Studio. And there's also Creative Music Foundation. Creative Music Studio, um, it went on to, they were doing, they eventually kind of settled in Woodstock, New York. They were putting on workshops in churches with people like Jack DeJohnette, Dave Holland, even classical people like Frederick Jevsky, classical pianist, and kind of wherever they could. And by 1976, I guess it was, they ended up actually acquiring a place, an old lodge that had been a resort up in the Catskills, and they took it over. And for a good solid, I want to say about 7, 8 years or so, they had this place and they put on workshops with all kinds of people, um, many from the jazz world, jazz avant-garde, but also from the new music world. And it got to be a place where, from what people were starting to call world music, which was all encompassing, but people who were not necessarily from what we think of as the jazz world, from Africa, from India, from Japan, South America, came to teach there. And so in 1977, I read an ad in the back of Downbeat magazine, And my best friend at the time, Steven Bernstein, who I mentioned earlier, who was a year younger, I was 16 and he was 15, I guess, just barely. And we somehow convinced our parents to let us go to one of these workshops. And it was for, I think, 3 or 4 weeks in July of 1977. And we were in heaven. First of all, they didn't think they'd even have teenagers there. It was all people who were like college age, a little older. We were the youngest. Um, but we were happy with that. We were just, running wild, but we were just both very dedicated to music. So it was amazing to go there and study with some of our heroes. We got to study with Abdullah Ibrahim, Carla Bley, Jimmy Jufrey, Lee Konitz, John Cage even came through,
Oh, wow.
uh, and people who were starting to get known over here who had been known in Europe or in South America, like Nana Vasconcelos, Trilok Gurtu. Um, these are all people that we got to be around. And so fast forward, basically, um, as we know, the arts have gone through a lot of ups and downs. Right now, obviously, we're in a super challenging period. This happened to some extent back in the early 80s, where the NEA lost their funding and Creative Music Studio had relied to a large part on that. So they ended up losing their place. And since then, they haven't had an actual brick and mortar place. But the organization happily has kept going up to now, it relies on private foundations, donors. I've been since 2016, I've been one of the artistic directors of it. So I bring in people to do workshops. It's actually looking like we just talked this morning. Looks like Daphnis Prieto is probably going to do a workshop for us. And we just to wrap up about that, the amazing thing is that organization now has been going for 50 whatever years, 52 years or whatever, and continues to put on workshops with people who are the leading lights in creative music, be it jazz-based improvisational music or even composing, like Henry Threadgill has done some, Vijay Iyer has as well. We're getting more young people in there. We're really committed to getting a diverse array of voices in there, different backgrounds, different stylistic backgrounds, different ages. So
No, it sounds so diverse, to allow that to, you know what I mean, to bring in all these different artists and getting different perspectives on creative music is, that's remarkable.
yeah, yeah, we're very proud of it, and I think especially since some of us who are involved in it live in New York City, New York City is incredibly broad in terms of what you can see and hear and all that. And so we want this organization to be able to reflect that and also to appeal to young people, more because, that's so important. So basically, um, what I wanted to say is folks can go to creativemusic.org. That gives information on workshops that we're putting on.
I'll put a link to it also in the,
Yeah, that would be great.
yeah.
Thank you, man. And we have a home base near Woodstock in Kingston, New York, where we put on workshops every few months. Sometimes it's with me, sometimes it's with Ingrid Sertso, who's now I'm not at liberty to say her age, but let's just say that she's been around for a while and still going strong, doing vocal workshops and poetry workshops and rhythm workshops. Karl Berger, her partner, sadly passed away in 2023, but he started something which has been one of the fundamental projects of Creative Music Studio, going back to the 70s, which has been what they call the Creative Improvisers Orchestra. And he would do that, from time to time upstate. I even did a tour with him in 1979, which was my first time going on the road, first time going to Europe. And he had this huge group that he conducted. It was some of his compositions, but very much conducted improv that had Don Cherry, Lee Konitz, Leroy Jenkins,
Yeah,
Uh,
Peter, we're at about less than a minute. We're almost out of time before the meet. We're gonna have to do part two. Is that okay?
okay, great. Well, so I'll wrap that up. So basically, I took over the leadership of this Creative Improvisers Orchestra, which plays the last Sunday of every month, Sunday afternoons in Kingston, New York. So that's something to look out for. And it's always great, always different. And we have a lot of exciting guest artists coming up this year.
Beautiful.